I think to those of you who are new, a lot of you will be familiar that in IATI back in 2011, following the Busan commitments, we developed what's called the publishing statistics. So that was quite some time ago. And now we are looking at building this new measure, the data quality index. And the aim very much is to reach an agreement with everyone. So the community, all our stakeholders, of what is being measured, what good quality IATI data looks like, agree those measures with all publishers. And those are some of the questions I think we'll discuss about the consistency of measures across the different publishers, and then make sure that those are implemented into this new data quality index. Sorry, just a second. And then I think that the long-term aim and what we are looking towards, and also with our strategic plan, is to use this index to incentivize IATI publishers to drive up the quality and usability of IATI data. So in IATI's long-term strategic plan, one of the big commitments and objectives is about driving, improving data quality, and using this index would be one of the areas in which we can work towards that. So the measures being proposed, and I'll explain a bit more, I think, especially around the new areas to those who are not so familiar. But the two existing areas were around timeliness. I think a lot of you, especially also last year with COVID, like timeliness is one of the key qualities of IATI data and something that's important to be measured. Data completeness, looking at a subset of assessment areas that we will be looking at, and I'll summarize today. And then three new areas around validation, data complementarity, and I'll explain what that covered, and then trust in data, where we already had an initial discussion at the community exchange, and I think we'll focus on this today as well. Going on to the process, some of you, I think, already familiar. I know names of people who've already been involved and commented in the consultation. So at the start of September, we shared a background paper, quite a lengthy paper with all the proposed measures on Connect, and we received really useful feedback already. Thanks to everyone who are in this webinar who already commented. That's been really helpful. And then we had the session last week at the virtual community exchange, and had an initial discussion that I think we'll build on today. And we're having this webinar today where we can look at the feedback and go into some specific areas. And then the next phase, so after this webinar, we'll be looking at this feedback and going into developing the actual methodology for each of the assessment areas that would, of course, as well be shared with everyone. This slide looks at just some of the words that people use. So we've asked people how would they define good quality data, and those are some of the used that were being, the words being used, like complete, traceable, there's some of those areas. So this is just a visual of some of those key highlights. And then going into what we heard so far. So I want to start with this. I'll go in detail again on some of the specific areas and some of the initial discussion. So hopefully that would help you with the questions that we will be asking today for discussions, and you can share your views from your organization's perspective. So what we heard so far, again, different organizations commented on Connect. And overall, there is support. I think we've heard from the community about building this index, and that the focus should be on active activities. On timeliness, there was definitely support that there's a measure that should stay, we should focus on, and some specific suggestions for changes. And one question that I will ask everyone, and we can have a discussion on. Data availability, that was initially what we proposed, and I think we'll be changing into data completeness, which seemed a more specific measure, which looks at a subset of areas of IATI, such as humanitarian, location, traceability, and other areas. We talked about the validation measure being added into the index, which I think everyone agreed on. There were some specific suggestions for changes, but that's more on the validator side. And then there were quite a few areas on further discussions on how those measures can be adapted that we've already discussed a bit. So one was around, I think, feedback from the different types of organizations and the measures. So I think some organizations have more feedback on specific measures and how that matched to their organization. And the same around the areas of data complementarity, for instance, about comparing budgets and the budget periods being looked at. And then we talked about trust, which was a tricky one to define the measure and add to. We also last week had a very good discussion with a few of you, I think were also in this webinar, about some of the questions being raised. I think what was really flagged was, as we developed and build the index, it's really important to focus on user needs. So what is being presented? So when people go to the index, what are they, what does good quality data look like? What are the answers that they want to see there? I think people recognize the challenges of the difference of each assessment and being, fair and kind of adapted to each publisher. But I think from a user perspective as well, and I think a lot of publishers as well recognize that we do need some consistencies across the measures as well. We had some interesting discussions as well about kind of when we talked about predictability. So knowing what the publishers are planning to do. This was related to discussions on trust. And there was a mention of what previously in IATI there used to be something called an implementation schedule that's no longer used, but that's where organizations would specify, what they maybe start with their publication and at the later phase, how they would make improvements. That was quite an interesting suggestion. And then we also talked about the trust measure and how that would work. Again, the discussions was around whether checking trust in data by looking at whether the data is used in specific, third-party tools. So that was in relation, like, is it used in governments, and using that as a selection criteria. And I think on those ones, we'll pick up a bit more in the discussion of this webinar. I just wanted to give you an idea of the questions we'll discuss in the afternoon, and we can later in the session, and we can pick those that we want to focus more on. So we'll talk about timeliness, we'll talk about adjustments of the measures. So just to kind of think of those as I go through in the next few slides, again, about the summary of what we heard so far and what we will be discussing in the next hour. Some of the questions around timeliness, adjustments for each measure, how we keep that consistent. We'll talk about coverage, which is another really important area. Location, I think some suggestions will be really helpful in that, given the current feedback. Policy markers, we weren't able, I think, in the last session of the virtual community exchange really to discuss that. And then more of a kind of big question about how really, as this index is being developed, be made more useful to, to you as a publisher, as a user, and really be useful and be able to incentivize better publishing. So just to kind of give you an idea and to think about those questions as I go in through some of the feedback we've received so far. So I know some of you would have, seen this summary, but those of you who are joining this weren't able to join the community session, what we heard so far on timeliness, as I said, agreement that we need to keep this measure. It's really critical, and we do need to keep the frequency and time-like measures. We need to make sure that closed activities are not counted in that measure. And then in our proposal, and also in previous publishing statistics in IATI, we very much use the transactions, because that's the most common change that we see. There were some suggestions, so we'll talk about this as well, I think, in the discussion on do we need to increase the range of elements that counts towards timeliness in addition to transactions? And there were some specific suggestions, I think, from Oxfam on this one. In terms of the new measures, we checked for like how consistent a publisher's updates are. There was feedback on this as well because of the differences of activities, but that was something quite helpful to know, you know, at what point transactions are being updated. And then a very practical suggestions on the active versus inactive publishers. So this is not something that we've had before. And we know there's a lot of organizations that have not updated their data. And yeah, that's something that we will look at. And yeah, feel free to add to the chat. We will monitor as we go into the discussion. Data completeness. So this is another big area that will be forming part of the index. So you can see on the right side of the slide all the different categories, what we call, that were being proposed for the data quality index. So there's overall support for those categories. I mentioned as well the change, so we call them data completeness, and then look into each one of those areas. So one was on mandatory and recommended elements. Location, we'll have a discussion about this one. Classification, like what are the different sector classifications being used. Data availability around sustainable development goals. Traceability of data is another measure that there was support for. The financial and humanitarian data, and you can see results and coverage as well. We heard that it's important to ensure that the same metric isn't measured twice, and I think that was related to some of the humanitarian and location data. Talking about the difference in relevance for each measure for different organization types, and I think it's the one where we do need to find the balance of knowing kind of different publishers and their how the measures adapt to them, but also make sure that when somebody goes into this one single place, there's a consistent way of measuring and comparing. And then the support for the coverage measure, where we proposed use total expenditure. I think there was support for that, and we'll have a bit of a discussion on this of how useful this measure is. Is there a need to comparing it with what's published, not just in the organization, but in the activity file, and how organizations adapt to it? And then the three, as I summarized at the very start, the new measures, or what previously we didn't have in the publishing statistics, and was including validation statistics into the data quality index. So from last year, we now have the IATI validator, and which obviously just checks only the whether the files are linked to the follow the IATI schema and the IATI rule set, but it'll be really good to include this measure as well into one single place, so people don't have to go to multiple places. And then the other two measures that we proposed, one was on complementarity, which basically looked at three specific areas. So one was around assessing predictability. So looking at the measure where we can see what organizations have committed and then what they have spent. Usefulness of budgets, of knowing whether, like the forward-looking data that we mentioned, will be really good. And then talking about funding flows into and out of organizations. Agreement that it was difficult to measure trust, and I think there are various ways that this could be assessed. We had some initial discussions, as I mentioned, about kind of usability and third party and data being used in tools as a criteria for that, which we will consider and look into. And now I think we have a lot of time. I will stop here. I hope that was a useful summary. If there are any specific points or clarifications, we can, of course, go into those. But we have actually we have an hour to go into each question separately in all those 3 areas that I just mentioned. And you'll have a chance to, either raising your hand so you can ask a question, or also using the chat. And I think Amy will be helping as well with making sure we monitor that information. So going into the discussion area, and it would be really great to hear from everyone, from your perspective and from your organization. So the first 2 questions that we wanted to going through each one separately. The first one was around timeliness. So we discussed, and as I summarized, there is a lot of support to keep the time measure. And at the moment, the proposal is just to use transactions for that. So we wanted to hear from you, are there any suggestions for is that needed? Do we need to look into some additional measures, or do people agree that we do need to, at least at this point, just focus on transactions? I'll just take a look, and then I'll have a look at the chat on any feedback. So let me see on raised hands. I think I can see Herman.
Mute, yes.
Yeah.
And put on the video maybe. So, about timeliness, I think it's difficult to measure timeliness on other elements than transactions. Because, for instance, results, it's very dependent on on the organization, how often you can update result information. It's also very dependent on the type of projects you do. Some projects take a long time before you can measure the results. You can initiate a project, and it takes maybe 2 years or 3 years for the first results become visible. So then it would be an incentive for organizations, if you measure this, to produce results just for the sake of producing results, not because they are actually achieved. And I think you should be careful with this one. And transactions are, because of their nature, are more frequent. They have a higher heartbeat in the process, because usually funding is done once or twice a year, and if you have a large project portfolio, you can easily measure which is the most recent transaction in this project portfolio. But also here you need to be careful, because it can be that some projects do not have any disbursements for a year and a half, and then suddenly have a disbursement, also depending on the type of project you do. So in summary, I don't think you can measure this activity by activity, but you have to look at the whole set of activities. And secondly, I think it's difficult to use anything else consistently besides of transactions.
That's what we've currently proposed. Thank you, Herman. Sorry, Johanna, and thank you for your comments in the chat.
Yes, thank you. And I wish, in fact, we had stayed on the slides, because it was useful to actually have the details of what we were discussing, rather than moving so quickly through all of the slides and then having to now come back or having to remember what was on the slides. But and also there were comments put on discuss about those things, going into some details. And again, it would have been useful to understand for instance, if the technical team disagreed or had different views on some of the comments that were made on those things, it would have been useful to know that, or to understand what the counter arguments were, because I feel today we're going to repeat some of those things, and rather than perhaps moving forward in, if somebody said, well, what about this, then somebody else could say, well, here's why it doesn't work, and then we could actually go move along, and maybe take it a step further. Whereas now I feel that we're just rehashing the same things, and we're going to cover perhaps the same ground, or maybe a little more, but maybe not as much as we would have gone, because I'm still a bit unclear about why we can't go beyond transaction and say any update to the file can count as for timeliness. I don't know why we're so obsessed with transaction. I actually disagree with my good friend Herman on this. It so happens that in our case, a lot of our projects have like 2 transactions, and that's it. In a project that maybe lasts 5 years, because it's a grant and we give all the money up front, and that's it. And so our business model is gonna detract from the perceived timeliness of our publication. And I think it would be useful to take a step back and think about what it is that we're trying to do here, what matters, and think through what other ways we maybe can think of to assess whether or not the data is up to date. We have a timestamp on the files, and I know some people say, well, yeah, but this can be, this can be faked or something. And I find this disturbing, and this applies to this whole index. If we think that publishers are going to just cheat on their data to get a better, a better result on the index, okay, let's put it out there and just say that we think that IATI publishers are going to cheat to get a better result in the index. And let's just say that to the community. Is that really what, like, where does that come from? Is that really what we believe? I find that quite disturbing. I don't know if that's our starting point. Then this whole exercise maybe yeah.
Shall we see? I think we do trust publishers. I think, Johanna, to your comments on, I can come back to any of the slides if that's helpful, for sure. On timeliness, I think the addition of active and inactive was the suggestion to add something that looks at any change in the data. So basically be able to see, not focusing on specific elements, as the data, so the distinction between active and inactive publishers. I think that's where the suggestion was to check, and we'll develop this in the methodology. Has a change happened in any element? So in that specific assessment, looking beyond transactions. For the timeliness, this was something that before was used, in the publishing statistics. So that was our proposal. And there wasn't any specific additional one single element that we could include for the specific timeliness measures. So it was a matter of the combination between the two. So having an assessment where you look at any change, be able to see have updates happened, and then be looking at transactions as the kind of most commonly updated element. And I think that's why we're opening now the discussion. I think there's more people. There was one suggestion about, if we are adding an additional element, what would that be? I think there was a specific suggestion on Connect about looking at provider or receiver activity IDs, and then changes in title and description.
But why do we need to choose a single element? Why can it not be just any element, any change?
Yeah, well, that's
what I don't understand.
Yeah, that would already be done in the assessment of, like, is that organization as the publisher in the last 12 months, have they been updated, as opposed to the specific timeliness, looking at absolutely any change.
Okay, and hence my question. We would already be doing that. So why do we need an extra measure of timeliness on top of that?
I think because it looks at two, I mean, I would like to hear other views on this, but I think at the moment, at least from some of even the use cases about is the data like up to date and timely, a lot of the cases we're looking at the transactions and the updates of the transaction data. So that's what we're following through and kind of keeping on what we've previously had. Is your proposal, so Johanna, your thought is not to have these two measures, but just to have, you know, simple change. I think from a perspective.
My proposal is that if it's good enough to look at any change in a file to determine that the file has been updated, then any change in the file in the last month should count to say the file has been updated in the last month. It doesn't have to be a transaction. It could be any change in the file to satisfy us that the file has been updated.
I think it's a proposal. I'm not sure like how widely supported that was, but I think I'll come. I can see we have two new hands raised. From Michelle maybe first, and then Frank.
Yeah. So two things on Johanna, and I would agree with Johanna in that I understand that some of the data users want to know that financial transactions are current, but I also think that it disproportionately weighs financial transactions. And to Johanna's point, I think it's very often that you might have new information on a project that isn't related to a transaction, but is just as vital. Whether it's people are adding new elements, like all of a sudden a policy marker is being added. Okay, that's not a transaction, but that's important. And they have updated their date. So I would second Johanna in terms of saying is it shouldn't be that a transaction has to have changed, but if the file is a fresh file because there's new activities added or because there's new data about existing activities added, whether that is a transaction or not, it is updated information. So I would concur with Johanna on that. The other thing to answer Johanna's question about, you know, are publishers trying to cheat the system? And I would say, no, I don't think people are trying to cheat the system, but what some donors have tied funding to these scores. And that's why in last week's meeting, I was very vocal about why are we scoring as opposed to presenting the data? Why are we putting weights to certain elements as opposed to just saying these are the elements that people have? And I understand, you know, what doesn't get measured doesn't get tracked, and, you know, the old adages and things, but I think, and look, IOM doesn't have good scores, so I can tell you we don't cheat the system for scores, but I can tell you that people look at those scores, and it could be that because a donor is tying their giving to the IATI dashboard, people have an incentive to put things into elements that might not be accurate. So the quality isn't there, but it shows up as having been published, and therefore their scores look good. So that's where I was going with the why are we, I mean, I get bucketing between financial and value added and all these things, but there are weights given to all of that in the dashboard. And that's where people start to game the system. And so for me, I think that's what I like about the HUM portal, which is down at the moment, at least for the details. It lets me see who has elements out there. It doesn't tell me the quality, or it doesn't tell me that, you know, one is better than the other, but it at least allows me to say, hey, that organization has put SDGs in their data, that one hasn't, or that one has active appeal codes or not, without giving weight to what that means. Because to the point that has gone through discuss, and Johanna, you brought it up quite eloquently, different publishers have different things that are important to them. And as I keep harping, IOM is not a government. We do not measure ODA. So why is it that it matters that a flow type being ODA be in the system and get value added points for it when it's completely irrelevant for me as a publisher? So that's also why I'm against scores, why people might be gaming the system, and why I think just presenting what is there is as valuable as wait for this group to decide the weights and how do you weight it, and unless there is a way to make the nuances that say publishers should have these data points and recipients should have these data points and intermediaries should have these data points, and then it starts to get so complicated. I don't know who's going to look at it. So I'll end there, but that's my thoughts.
Thank you, Michelle. I think we have a discussion about, specifically the timeliness, like the proposition of does it look at any specific change? And I think that's what we'll propose as well as an option in the methodology. On your second point, Michelle, or how the data is presented, like seeing, for instance, like the whole data completeness areas. At the moment, most of the assessments are looking at like, is this information, is it published in the file? And I think one of the final questions we had is going in through the methodology, like, do we put a specific weight on each one, or is it each one? And I think you had this point about scoring, and if it's not a score, then how do we present this information with like a summary or description on it? But we don't have, we've not yet gone to the phase of how would each measure would be, how to say, weighted in this area. Frank, do you want to come in?
Yes, please. On this, on timeliness and in general, actually, I think we need to keep in mind quality for who, and I think the primary focus there should be on the quality for users. What is interesting for users when we measure quality? But and at the same time, we need to acknowledge this tension there is between user needs and my and every other publisher's need to look good in an index or whatever. I mean, it's there. So we should be careful not to create perverse incentives to kind of game it or to publish things or not publish things for that matter that would give a score that was, or if not a score, then a picture of the organization that not satisfactory. And I think part of the solution to weigh that is to really focus on the core. I think, now I'm talking a little more generally, but when I looked into this consultation first, I don't have, this is not my full-time job to do this. And frankly, I was overwhelmed by the details and so on. And that says something about me, of course, but I think it also says something about where we're going with this. And are we really focusing on the core, or are we falling into the temptation of doing or responding, accommodating every thought that say it could be interesting if you could also do that, or it would be nice to, and so on. What is the core of quality for our users, or for the data users here? I think we really need to keep on focus on that. So some of the later ones we're going to discuss on added value and so on, is that a quality measure or is it something else? For example, I mean, we are messing up the picture. I think if we try to include everything that could be nice to have in this. So yeah. And I don't have the answer of what is the best timeliness measures for users, and users are also different. Not only publishers are different, but also users are different. So it's not necessarily easy to answer that. But I think just as I would urge us to keep that focus in developing this, developing this tool.
Yeah. I mean, I think, notes taken on, it is a lot of content. I think on the data user side, that did come from everyone looking for suggestions. I think a lot of the proposals were trying to incorporate as well some of the suggestions from working collaboratively as well with this with like UNDP and on some of the user needs, but how I think how this is being used and how the information is being presented. I think that's the main bit about having all these assessment areas that we've proposed, and maybe once it's out there, like how do you users, and as Michelle says, publishers are users, so they go and look into specific assessment areas that are relevant to them, as opposed to having just one single like score related to the publishers. So I think on timeliness, Herman, do you have, is this a legacy hand or you want to come in?
No, I'd like to still add one more thing to timeliness. What I think is the essence of timeliness is that what you publish in IATI is an actual representation of what your own administration is. And basically, you can't measure timeliness within IATI when you can't compare it with your own administration. But given the fact that once you publish something in IATI, you do not have access to the administration of the publisher, I think what's important when measuring things is see if there is anything new. Is there a new activity? Is there a new transaction? Is there a new indicator? Is there a new indicator period added? And not try to measure any element if anything has changed, because that would mean that when you correct a typo in a title, that it would also count as a relevant update of the file, and that would imply that you are timely, but that is not. So I would think focus on new transactions, new results, new elements within the file, and then not on an activity by activity basis, because the practice is that a lot of activities are the same for extended period of time, maybe many months, maybe a year or more, but look at the whole portfolio. You can have 10 activities, and when in one activity a new transaction is added or a new result is added, it's fair to say, I think, that there is an actual update of the publisher's file representing their own administration.
Okay, yeah. So is there then, I think in this one, given the feedback, the balance of, we have the measure where you have when a new transaction is being added, but at the same time, we also have, for each publisher, you'll be able to see if any change has happened. So it's about how this is presented in the index, but you have the two assessments at the same time is what we're currently thinking of. That fits again, you have timeliness, you have your list of publishers, and that's where you're looking at the assessments. Because I think so far we've never had the assessment of any change, which we do want to incorporate now in the index, and whether that's by highlighting publishers or not, but including those two. I think will be a suggestion. Anyone else on the timeliness discussion? And I'm happy to go back to any of the slides on the specific questions, if that would be helpful. The other question we asked, and we've started a discussion on, was around, adjustments being, yes.
But yeah, sorry, the question about on timeliness was the question about the dates, the consistency of the date. Was that in timeliness?
Yes. Yeah.
So yes, could we actually please go back to that slide just to make sure that we do cover all the not call them timeliness, not call them elements, because that's confusing with the standard.
Yeah. assessment areas. Yeah. So yeah, timeliness, one of the suggestions was also to look into an organization has multiple activities and looking specifically at how, let's say, our organizations updating them on a monthly basis, a specific time, or for different activities that is completely different. We did have already feedback on Connect that it's not possible for that to be consistent for all activities because of the nature of activities, and also some of the development finance institutions that was quite difficult because they have their sovereign and non-sovereign activities, which would not be possible. But I know, Johanna, you had feedback on this, that it's...
Yeah, so there is no value to that measure, really. Like, it's timeliness is what matters. This is not a measure of timeliness, it's a measure of consistency based on, I mean, there was no rationale provided really for it. It goes against the notion, the principle of parsimony. This index shouldn't have 75 measures in it if we want it to be useful. As Frank was saying, where it's overwhelming already. It has so many measures in it, and really should focus. And this feedback was provided already on Discuss in general, that it has too many elements, and we should really try to simplify it. And this is really one aspect that provides very little added value, if any, and we would suggest to remove. It's not going to happen on a specific date, if only because most organizations don't work on weekends. So
yeah. I think that's one where there was, I think organizations have different input on it. So it's something that, we don't have to include. I think the challenge on the overall comment about, yes, it's a lot of measures, there wasn't nothing was missing, but at the same time, there wasn't a suggestion of, we don't need this at the moment, and I think incorporating and making sure that the measures are there and then being able to look at specific areas was what we were trying to propose, as opposed to not including, for instance, SDGs as part of the overall assessment, is being able to at least know, is the data there or not, was the suggestion. But we've noted that on the consistency. Was there anything around this area on timeliness that people wanted to discuss? So adjustments, I think we briefly talked about this, about different publishers have different, requirements and needs. So whether we look at the different organization types and roles, I think we had initial discussion on, it is irrelevant if we're speaking about just older others and having a bit more of a consistency. So we didn't come up with any, I'd say, specific adjustments that needed to be made. We discussed about the difference between, humanitarian and development, and that's not something that we'll be incorporating as this adjustment. But any other, thoughts or suggestions around, we need to be including all 1,400 now publishers, looking at this assessment areas. And do people mostly support that, even though there are some downsides, we do need to try and keep this consistent across publishers. Michelle, do you want to come in?
Well, I just have a question, because you just mentioned pulling in all of the publishers, and, we have to be consistent across publishers. So are we giving up the idea that there would be different, that there would be different measurements depending on the role, like number 2? When you say adjustments, you mean adjustments in the data, or adjustments in the way we assess being based on organization type and role? Because I think you just mentioned, if we're not making a distinction between humanitarian and development, that the fact that humanitarian came in as an afterthought and it's a tab on the statistics, but it's not part of the weights. And yet for some publishers, not having humanitarian data is key and a problem. To me, it would make more sense to add the two, you know, to make those distinctions. So I'm curious there.
So one question is, yeah, which would be quite complex to adjust the methodology depending on this. The other option is how we present the information. So let's say you want to look into the index and a specific score, and then you're able to say, okay, now I want to look at the organization type, multilateral, for instance, so that you're able to have this picture of, I'm currently looking at a specific organization type, and you wouldn't be expecting that in all assessment areas there will be, talk about location, other areas, explaining this in the information page on the dashboard, that's why their scores, so they're not able to publish this information because of the different type of organization.
Yeah, I mean, I just point out, and I think it has come up before, is for donors, like the government donors or the beginning of the food chain, it's hard for them to, in traceability elements, because they don't know what the receiver data is going to be numbered, like, and that's huge, because again, that's scored a particular weight in the system, and they will get dinged if they don't put that in there. But if they put in something just to make it there, it's not quality data. So I do think it's important that we break down whatever we're doing and say, this is the stuff we look at for this group and this group, and figure out what the groups are, and then figure out what's appropriate for each group, I think is going to be necessary. But again, I hate scores, so I'll shut up. That part will drive me nuts till the end.
I think we have Johanna and her. You want to come in, Johanna, first, and Renata after that?
Yeah, thanks. Going back to the first principle, that the index is about data quality and should be driven by a user perspective, and therefore should really focus on the core requirements for the data to be useful to users, and not the nice to have. It really should assess the quality of the data that is absolutely essential for it to be useful, for it to be usable. And so that should be the same across all publishers. Although I agree with Michelle and others that the reality is that some aspects will be more useful than others, if it comes from a bilateral donor, or if it comes from an NGO, or if it comes from a humanitarian. But there should be some data from the bilateral donor data set, should contain at least some data from all of the core, for all core elements, no matter what. Otherwise, it's not going to be useful. And so maybe we don't give a pass to anyone, but it could be that in reality, when we don't compare them, or when we come to scoring or to comparing performance, maybe we shouldn't actually compare them. Like, we should compare them to their peers, and not, we should compare CSOs against CSOs, and we should compare humanitarian to humanitarian. And throughout all of that, there are really good lessons to be learned, I think, from the Aid Transparency Index, which doesn't do that, and where we end up having to do that ourselves. And when we explain our scores to our, senior management, we always say, well, don't forget that all of the best scoring organizations are multilaterals. It's unfair to compare us to them. And if you just compare us to the bilateral donors, we're doing really well.
Yeah.
because they apply the same methodology, and they rank us all together. So applying the same methodology is probably fine, but then comparing the performance needs to take into account, your peers, kind of thing. But if we do a good job with the index that's really focusing on the core elements and on the things that really matter, we should be able to apply it across all publishers. At least let's aim for that and see down the road, and if we do have to make adjustments by organization would be my preference. Let's really strive for a universal methodology.
Yeah. Okay. And sorry, Renata, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Very interesting discussion. I want to come in on the distinction of the different donors and also on the scores. It's true that we have been, as European Commission, we have also been talking quite a lot to the member states of the European Commission, and we realized that there is a big difference, obviously, between the bilateral donors and the multilaterals, and then you have civil society, you name it. So we were advocating to have this distinction, but I must say that also quite, I find it also very interesting what Joanna is proposing, that you dramatically cut down the elements against the indicators, so that that you have only the core ones, and then you can compare. But if we have more indicators, I think we would need a distinction, because the scoring is important. It's not so important for transparency or for our work as such, but it's for us, it's the only way to have this attention from our hierarchy, or have the attention of politicians. So we have to find, and then again, this gives a push to our technical work. We need to have this backing, and that's why I think, be it scoring or something else, but we need to have a simple message which we can pass on to our management, to see how we are doing, and a message which will be motivating to continue this transparency work on a technical level. So that's why we are super interested in the index, and that's why we think you have to compare apples with apples and pears with pears. But then again, if we manage to only have the essentials, then maybe we can compare everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Renata. And I'll come back to you, Herman, and see if there's any others. I mean, that's one, it's deciding on, when we talk about core, and if it's the same for all, do we look at the section around mandatory and recommended, which is very, limited data, where it is the minimum that, across all publishers, we need to make sure that's included. And then I'm thinking about all the other assessment areas that we've talked about, maybe finding a best way of adjusting that more to the specific organization terms. Herman, do you want to come?
Yes, I agree with Michelle that it's absolutely essential to take the role of the publisher in the network into account. And I also like the idea of Johanna of keeping it as simple as possible and focusing on the core elements. Having said that, the question, of course, is what are those core elements which are essential for everyone? And I think when we go into the details of that discussion, it could prove a little bit more difficult than we think right now. So that will be a really interesting discussion. And the third point I wanted to make, and again, I'm in agreement with Michelle, I think, is that the whole fact that we have a ranking over all publishers means that you're focusing on who is best and what can we do to make our score better. And I think the focus of this index should be far more on what is the room for improvement you in your role in the network as a publisher you have, without necessary ranking or putting an index score on it. Because what you want to, you do this because you want to drive improvement. You want to have an incentive that publishers are going to improve their publications. And when you rank everyone and you put a score to that and you say some are very bad and some are excellent, very good, maybe the publishers who are very bad will get a disincentive to put any more effort in it because they think we will be bad anyway. So I would say
the alternative of scoring, it's how we present the usefulness of the data. I think, how do you present for each assessment area what is missing or what needs improvement, as opposed to just having a one-off.
Yes, and I would make it as not, I would explicitly not frame it as what is missing. I think I would frame it as where is room for improvement given our experience with IATI and what we see that others can do.
Anyone else in the group who wants to come in on those two? And then I think we have another half an hour to decide what other areas we want to discuss in this session. I know there was some questions around the data complementarity, and maybe we focus on that. Let me just go into that slide around data complementarity and trust, if people would want to, again, focus on those more detailed measures, or if people are interested, we can look into, again, the questions around coverage. I think we had quite a bit of a discussion last time already on this section. So I would suggest we probably go into the data complementarity, and maybe I can explain a bit on what that covers, so we can go into detail. Sorry, Johanna, you have your hand raised.
Sorry, because I raised my hand because the first question was trust, and it was before you said, well, let's do data complementarity first. But I just wanted to actually put on the table the notion that trust doesn't belong in a data quality index. The index should be as objective as possible, a measure of the actual quality of the data that is published. The level of trust that users have in the data that is published is an interesting idea, but it doesn't belong in the index. It's something that perhaps can be worked on separately, and it's probably a much longer term thing. It needs a lot of thinking. It's a difficult concept. It's a difficult project. It requires quite a bit of thinking, quite a bit of work to define, to try to grapple with. It risks really not derailing, but probably delaying the index, and it's always going to, it brings an element of subjectivity and to some extent mistrust in the index, and I think it would be much better to keep the index on its own as an objective measure and as something that can be rolled out quite quickly once the methodology is agreed, and it can be improved and it can be expanded perhaps over time, etc., and keep the work on trust, etc., separate. And therefore we can actually get moving on both in parallel rather than have perhaps one kind of delay and complicate the other.
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. I think that came out in the last discussion when we talked about how useful the data is. And I think there are other measures of how we can present that as opposed to just having this. And it came into the consultation that there wasn't an easy way to do that, and also to name it trust. So I think that's the feedback so far, to not incorporate. Frank, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I basically wanted to support Johanna in this.
Yeah.
I really think that, yes, if I don't understand the thoughts behind the trusts, then it's not really about trust. It's more about the kind of a measure of the impact of yes, if it actually does what we all hope it does, that it's the data is used to add value, and that's a good exercise, but it's not a quality measure in line with the other. So I would definitely support that is taken out of the discussion of the quality index. I'm not against working on this, but I don't think it belongs here.
No, thank you, Frank. I think, yeah, where it came was again from consultation with like results framework and all that, but I do agree with the feedback so far about working on the index, and it's something that would come as part of it. And I think the naming of just saying measuring trust is not the right one. Anyone who hasn't yet been involved in this discussion around trust and wants to add to the discussion? Okay, I think that on this one, there is a lot of agreement that it would be best to postpone and not, we had it in the consultation, but we didn't come with anything that's really right at this time. So data complementarity, I think we can spend maybe a bit of time on it. So this was something that we tried to add additionally, where it's not just looking at what data is available, are you publishing SDG data about the traceability elements and all that. But there were 3 suggestions, and again, they weren't shaped in a lot of detail because it was more about different bits of the data that complement each other and that would help us to show, like, is this useful? So the suggestions on this one was about assessing what I mentioned, predictability. So for instance, that was about looking at whether what organizations have committed, whether that's then following through into their spend. I know in a lot of visualizations that's coming as well. On some of the data use needs, like data suggestion was about usefulness of budgets. So basically being able to see at the time of updating whether budgets were available. And we said this about the next 3 years, but we already had feedback about this would really depend on the duration of the activity. If the activity is just for a year, of course, you won't be able to assess this. And then the other one, which again needs a lot more methodology work, is looking at, is it possible to assess like the funds flowing in and out of the organization? So this is again linked to traceability, where we were just checking, is this included or not? But basically being able to compare and to look at the funds coming from a provider organization and going into a receiver organization. So those are all those areas were not yet methodologically like shaped in detail, but we were trying to look at assessments that actually look into different elements and be able to, to show the kind of complementarity of the data. Frank, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to me, most of this sounds more like use cases of the data rather than quality measures. So again, I think it's kind of it's not really hitting the target for quality measure. And I mean, my head was almost exploding with all the specificities of this, and how different some of these measures would be relevant and not relevant to different kind of organizations and so on. So I mean, but I can see why they can be interesting and relevant to dive into and learn more about. I would think to get a revamped quality measure or tool or whatever we index, whatever it's going to be up and running. I think this belongs somewhere else too.
Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple, like a little bit more context, I think, for these measures. Obviously, the ask here was to, like, both with trust and the complementarity measures. The reason for adding these is the idea that, like, we want to make this more robust and rather like than just is the information there. And so the idea is that if, like, you know, you have individual pieces of information, that's good, right? So like, that's what the completeness measures. It's like you have a piece of information in this data field or in that data field, right? But in order for the data to have meaning overall, you have to have multiple pieces of information that you can put together in a certain way. And like, so it's nice that publishers publish, you know, this data in this field, right? And like that data is really good quality, but it's not particularly useful if it's not combined with other pieces of necessary information. So that was kind of like the title of this is a bit, you know, I mean, certainly open for discussion and like how we frame this, but that was kind of the overall point of including this because you know, like you have to have those multiple pieces of information in order to give the data meaning. And also like, so like the potential, like, you know, as you call them, use cases or like ways in which the information can be used are the, like, you know, some of the ones that are listed here. These are, you know, of course, this is open for discussion and we wanted to hear ideas on other measures that or other ways in which folks would suggest assessing this. But these are the ways in which the primary intended beneficiaries of IATI data need to be able to use the information, right? So it's like they need these pieces of information to come together to be able to make the information useful. So, I mean, the point of this index overall, right, is to drive improvements in data quality that are going to be beneficial to data users. And so, you know, that's sort of just to provide a bit more context. That's kind of the rationale behind these ones that are here, because that's what we hear all the time is like, this information is not useful if I'm not able to have commitments and spending and assess predictability. And that's for governments, that's for civil society, you know, like monitoring, you know, doing donor accountability. So like, I think that there's definitely space for additional things here, but that's kind of the rationale is to drive improvements that are going to make the data meaningful and useful by our targeted data users.
Thanks, Sarah, for the context. And again, I think that's what I was saying. It's something as a proposal because it's not shaped in, you know, in a lot of detail, and it goes beyond the kind of other assessment areas. So that's why we're trying to get feedback on this. Again, I think we have Johanna and Herman's hands raised.
Thank you. I actually find that quite interesting, but I think it needs more work. And I would actually suggest making this kind of a phase 2, announcing that it's coming, that the intent is to make it part of the index at some point, but it's not quite ready. It needs more work. And developing the actual use cases. I could see something like having the specific use cases and assessing the data against the use case that requires the, you know, having the full budget and the transactions and the forward disbursements, etc., like and giving them names and you know, like building those scenarios, and therefore you would know that publisher Y, the data is actually very good for the scenario of the village X in Ghana, but it doesn't really work when you're using the scenario of Bolivia project XYZ. You know, you make up those cases, but they're concrete, they're real. And so you can see when a given set of data works for X scenario, but not in Y scenario. And that would be very useful for us as well, to explain to colleagues, to explain to management, this is the real concrete impact of us not publishing this data here, because otherwise it's all very abstract. But so having those real use cases that don't change over time, you know, yeah, it would just make it more real. And if we could actually see the use case that you're suggesting, we could dissect it, we could understand it, and we could say, yeah, okay, we understand that these elements and the way you're putting them together, yes, it makes sense. And you do need all of those data elements in order for this use case to work. And we could buy into that. And we could say, okay, yeah, that scenario works. And we agree to being assessed against it. But, you know, that will take time, will take consultations to develop. And so it would be a really interesting project. And I seem to recall that way back when, it had been suggested that the tech team work on something like that, again, to assess the usefulness of data, to really develop those use cases in order to assess the data quality. So it's going in the right direction. It's just that it's not quite there. And it's hard, therefore, for us to say agree or disagree, because it's still very preliminary. It's still very abstract.
There, and now we have come to Herman, and then I think I'm sure Sarah can respond. I think this is a practical suggestion of, you know, we need to go into the next phase of methodology, like how much detail at the moment. We don't have all level of detail. I think, and I'm sure Sarah can speak about the use case, like how we present this, because it's a lot about how this is communicated, about the importance of this work. So I think that is a practical suggestion and how it's being phased out into the methodology. Herman, and then I'll come back to Sarah.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment very much like Johanna made. I think data complementarity as a term is a bit abstract to understand, but where it comes down to that, it is really data completeness in the context of a certain use case. And if you would have it redefined as data completeness, it could be an extension of the current assessment of data completeness. And I think that would be less abstract and more, you can make it more concrete, you can make it more practical.
Do you mean, Herman, let's say in a specific area where, let's say we're looking at budgets, to kind of have this additional, let's say, assessment as opposed to having a separate measure?
Now, let's say, for instance, if you want to know for a certain activity, if how far this activity has been progressed, the good measure is to see what has been committed and how much has been disbursed or expended. And the difference between those two is how much needs still to be done. So it's not very useful to, when you want to assess progress of an activity, to only publish commitments or to only publish disbursements or expenditures. It's important to publish them both, because then for the use case, looking how far a project has progressed, that would be very good information, and you have them both. And that's just one example.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I guess I'll respond to Herman's point first, because I definitely understand the logic there. And I think that, like, the idea, at least for, you know, a couple of these, was to use completeness, like some of the completeness measures, and then combine those to be able to assess these measures, right? So I think, but I mean, it does also include, like, for the budget planning, like some measures of timeliness as well, right? Because it's like that information needs to be reported at a certain time to be useful, right? Before the budget planning cycle, like in order for it to be useful for governments. But I will just say, like, on this thing of real use cases, I think the challenge here is that, you know, there's a lot of information. The index is quite big. There's lots of measures. So I think there isn't a lot of that presentation of evidence here. But I think that that's a really good point, because I think that it does seem a bit abstract, but I can definitely assure you that there is that, you know, that evidence in terms of, like, real use cases. And so there's a lot of work happening to look at this kind of stuff. And, like, every day I'm supporting governments to actually use the data from, like, particularly using the country development finance data tool. So, like, you have the budgets there, you have commitments there, you have spending there. And so, like, I'm constantly doing this assessment. So, like, you know, I just shared a spreadsheet with the government of Tanzania looking at predictability using IATI data, right? So like you can very easily tell when you do quickly a pivot table, like looking at like what budgets have been provided and what spending has been provided. There's gaps on both sides, right? And so the overall analysis of that doesn't make any sense. So you can't like aggregate up and analyze that even for a particular donor group, like for bilaterals, right? Because some organizations don't report budgets, some don't report spending. So overall, it doesn't make sense. At an organization level, if the organization is reporting both pieces of information, it makes more sense, right? So I guess like the challenges, and I definitely you know, hear that, you know, that information, you don't have that information in front of you, so that makes a lot of sense. But just to say that like we
Sarah, Sarah,
Yeah.
that's my point, is the use case here, the scenario here would be, is Canada's data fit for purpose to feed into Tanzania's aid system? So you know what are the requirements for the Tanzania aid system. You would be able to assess and tell and tell the world, well, Canada's aid data is not bad or really bad, or, you know, fit for purpose, not so fit for purpose for that particular use case. And you would describe the use case. That's my point.
Right, and that work is underway as well with the how publishers publish analysis, right? And so like we're specifically looking at those kinds of things. So I definitely hear you on that point. But just to say that, like, you know, these things are proposed, you know, driven by the evidence that we've collected as part of this work.
Yeah, and I think it's about communicating that evidence. I think the practical, and I'll come back to you, Frank, it's kind of how is that evidence communicated in a simpler way? Because that's what I'm hearing, you know, explaining or just saying data complementarity it's not easy for people to understand. So I think on this specific one, I take the point about maybe not adding it now as a specific, you know, complete separate measure, but working on those, like evidencing those use cases and seeing how some of those would link to the current, build on the current measures. And then on trust, I think we already discussed that. I think this does need more work into going further in further iterations. Frank, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, just when we talk about these things, I think there's a tendency to apply a too simplified model of how development work works. If you say, for example, use commitment versus disbursement to say something about quality, there can be many reasons why, for example, disbursements are delayed. It can be a very good reason. I mean, it can be a really high quality measure because it proves adaptability. COVID happened, so we didn't disperse yet. We realigned the budget. We did something else. Major corruption case happened in the environment of the project, so we had to stop, and so that would be very sound practice to do that. And if the capacity builds up slower than anticipated, then disbursement will be slower and so on. And in the case of taking Tanzania again, with the Tanzania and the bank, the Tanzania government would be the first one to know why disbursements was delayed. So it doesn't really becomes I have a hard time to see it as a quality measure to compare these things, because it all depends on the context, and you cannot really hardwire context into these kind of things, as far as I can see.
I think if I understand correctly, it's about, again, the differences of organizations, like if we are to include this in terms of using disbursement. I think we have a few minutes left. I think the discussion is something that we'll add on Connect following this conversations. I think that was useful about having more time. You know, the data complementarity and the trust are not there yet to be fully incorporated. I think the last maybe point, and I'll open to the group as well, and we've already discussed before we go into the next step, is we talked about this, but to you as a user, how can we make it the most useful? You're a publisher, but also a user. We talked about, focusing on kind of core elements and making sure that it's coming from a user perspective. But just in the last maybe 5 minutes before we go into we'll be going to the next kind of methodology phase. From you in very brief works, how can this, thinking of the long-term, like 5-year plan, improving data quality, how can this be made most useful to you? Frank, you can come in first.
Yeah, I actually think one of the most useful features would be if this index made it easy for me as a publisher to see who else that looks like me, looks like my organization, publish something that is deemed to be of high quality that I do not, or where my quality is lacking, and go and learn from that other organization or these other organizations. I try to do that sometimes with the current index, and there are some ways to do it, but it's not very easy. So if you can say that the peer learning aspects of facilities became a more efficient in the new index, I think that would be extremely useful.
Thank you. You can also type in the chat as well if you have any thoughts, Herman. Sorry, Herman. Yeah, did you want to come in?
Yes.
Yeah.
For me, to make it useful, there are 2 important points, I think. One is that the index should not really be an index, but should be more as a means to see where are your areas for improvement as a publisher, given the fact that your data are used in practice and they need and that they have added value. That's one. Where should I improve? And the second one is, did I make progress on this compared to the past? And it's not that important that I have a score A, B, C, D, but I think it's important that I say when I have a D now, that next year I have a C, and in 2 years I maybe have a B. So where did I improve? And to give an incentive to publishers who actually improve their publications. And that would argue against having one number representing you on the ranking of all the publishers. I think that would, then you would copy the A Transparency Index, and that has a lot of harmful consequences. Instead, people are then gaming the index because they know they are politically being measured against the index, and it doesn't matter if it's useful or not. And I think this index should avoid that trap.
Yep. Anyone else from the group who maybe not participated and just wants to share, overall without the details?
Hi, Betty, Riza here. Sorry, I'm having trouble raising my hand, so I'm going to jump in.
Yeah.
I just want to share my thoughts on the efforts. Earlier, Herman was mentioning that, when you put a score on a publisher, if they are bad, then, they will be like, thinking that, they won't put an effort that, I'm still anyway bad, right? So that's true. While agreeing to Herman, in the meantime, I want to share that, in the past, I have seen that, publishers taking the other aspect as well. Like, for example, I have seen that publishers, because on the IATI statistics, they were showing the low scoring, they put effort to increase it because it drove them to make improvements because they were looking bad. So it's one of those, the incentive they see it, like, for example, like, the first question, how can this, data quality index be most useful? So those publishers can take this index to, one thing is like, to show how good their data is, or like, to show them that, how much effort they have put in order to make their data transparent. On the other hand, that showing that score also will help the data users, because if I am trying to use the IATI data, so just to give an overall picture of that, how these data published, like, for example, if I am looking to use a specific publisher's data, looking at this score, I'm not saying that, score in numbers, like, at least, categorizing good, bad, or this thing, will give an idea of the data users that, before they use, to understand that, whether this data is kind of like very useful for them, or it tells that, it gives a flag saying that, using this data will have some sort of, um, data quality issues or something. So in that sense that, I fully support having some sort of, scoring, in the sense, not put a number, or at least categorizing them as like, without showing that, whether you are 99 out of 100, but it's still categorizing that, these publishers are publishing very good data and need improvement. So in that sense that, I support that we should have some sort of way to, assess the overall index, and, give some incentive to those publishers who are putting efforts to make good data available. Thanks.
Thanks, Reza. So I heard a lot about the usefulness comparison to others, showing improvements. So being able to trace that. I think we have some discussion on timeliness. I think very briefly to summarize, and then I want to then about timeliness. I think removing specific measures around consistency on the transaction dates. I think, Johanna, you had a question now in the chat about, feedback on specific measures. The methodology, there will be an opportunity. I think so far there wasn't any, besides the finance flow and aid types, which was commented on Connect, there was some feedback about taking those out, but on any of the other big measures, there was, there was a suggestion to take them out. So yes, that's, that's possible to feedback also in the methodology phase. In terms of next steps, we had two discussions. We had a discussion at the community event. We had a discussion today where I think, especially around the measures of trust and data complementarity, we talked about that further progress is needed, maybe in a second iteration, which we'll post on Connect. So I think, yeah, next steps are keeping an eye again on the consultation on Connect. If you do have any follow-up questions, to come back to us on any specifics. And then the next step is very much incorporating all the discussions and going into something that's more looking at each area and focusing on the methodology that will be taking place in November. But thank you everyone for the participation, and for those who hopefully listened in. I hope that was useful to you to at least bring more understanding of the current proposal. Thanks everyone. If you have any questions, follow-ups, do email us.